Hello, let's give this a go, shall we? In case you're wondering what this is, that's the bow end of my open water rowing shell. It's 21 feet long. You can do that when you're single, have a 21-foot boat hanging in your apartment. As you might imagine, there's much cursing in the spring when I take it out, and again when I bring it back in the fall. Anyway, this first lecture is on responsibility. Now, we started out the course saying that ethics is a matter of answering the question, what ought I to do? Responsibility is somewhat different. We're concerned with what someone else should have done, as well as oneself. And this is reflected in how case studies are organized. Basically, 2 points of view that a case study can be done from. One is first person, usually fictional cases where the question is, what should I do? Given the circumstances, the main figure in the case is given decisions that that person needs to make. In historical cases, we're looking at it from the outside as to, and then we can judge that what someone should have done that was not done, or whether something was admirable or something was wrong. So considering responsibility lets us raise the other kind of ethical question. That's a different way of conceiving of the whole ethical enterprise. So there are two basic questions that we can approach ethics from. One is, what ought I to do? And the other is, what ought I to be? So with responsibility, we're concerned with the connection between a person and his or her actions. Let's start by getting a handle on what the word means precisely. Responsibility, of course, has at least 4 different meanings. It can mean, say, a role duty. Your responsibilities in this position are to do A, B, C, and D today. It can mean conscientiousness. You can trust her. She's a responsible person, meaning that she takes her duties seriously. It has a sense of competence. For example, children, senile people, we don't hold them responsible for their actions as much as someone else. And finally, accountability related to competence, blameworthiness, praiseworthiness for one's actions. So the connection between oneself and one's actions. It's a difficult concept. It has a relationship with concepts that we might call moral psychology, which include some of these we'll be looking at. Choice, what a choice is, what a voluntary action is, what an intentional action is, regret, remorse. We need to understand some of these before we can be confident in assigning responsibility. We hold people responsible for their actions, for what they do, but people do all kinds of things. We blame Smith for what Smith does, but not for what Jones does. We say things such as, it's not my fault that I got home late. He didn't do that on purpose. My hand slipped, or I didn't see the car entering the intersection. He didn't do it intentionally, but he did it nonetheless. The things we do unintentionally, we do. It wouldn't occur to us to offer an excuse for something that we didn't, to offer an excuse for something that we didn't do at all. So which of the things that people do are we to hold them responsible for? Why do we need to excuse people for what they've done? So we're going to need some understanding of what it is to do something unintentional too. And to do that, it'll be useful first to distinguish between voluntary and intentional action. Aristotle tells us what a voluntary action is. An action that satisfies 3 conditions: knowledge, choice, and stable character. To be responsible for what we've done, we must know what we're doing. Say that somebody who, well, let's say we're in a classroom and the door is shut. Let's say it's a classroom without a window in the door, and we open it, and it opens out, and unknown to us, there was someone on the other side changing a light fixture. We knock him off the stepladder, and he breaks his arm. Are we responsible for that? Well, if we'll be responsible for our voluntary actions, an appropriate excuse would be, well, I didn't know he was out there. If we had reason to think that he was out there, that would be something else. But to the extent that we don't, that's a fairly legitimate excuse. Second is choice. It's not enough to know what we're about. It has to be up to us. If, for example, you're held down, or let's say your car breaks down, you have an important meeting to make, someone's counting on you, and your car breaks down in an unexpected way. We could say, I'm sorry, I couldn't make it. My car broke down. I had no choice. And depending on the circumstances, if it's clear that one had no choice, then that would be a sufficient reason. Those are the two most important. Stable character is the third. This accounts for the times when we might be inclined to say that somebody was not him or herself. When somebody acts out of fear or rage. You'll notice one of the two books in the course is Conduct and Character. Those concepts are related. Conduct isn't simply action. It's action that proceeds from character. And character we can associate with the idea of an action being characteristic of somebody. If you hear a report of a friend who did something, you might say, that sounds like him. It's characteristic of that person. This is important ethically to the extent that our character is up to us, that we have some control over it. We can mold it. If we embarrass ourselves at a party and talking about politics, for example, we might say, well, I'll count to 10 before I do that again, and mitigate that in the future, possibly. Well, is that sufficient? Is that all we need? Voluntary action. We're responsible for our voluntary actions. Here we have a problem. Voluntary action includes two subcategories, habitual and intentional. Most of our actions are habituated. You think about what we do, manipulating objects, walking, opening doors, and so on. We don't think about them at all, do we? When we learn, my example before, I think, learning how to drive a stick shift. When we do that initially, when we're learning it, we think about everything, the relationship, the coordination of the clutch and accelerator, the position of the gear shift, the revolutions of the engine. As we get more competent at it, we don't think about it at all. Competence is a matter of habituating actions, which is fine. But what we want before we're comfortable in assigning praise or blame, holding people accountable for their actions is a more fine-grained concept of action. Hence, we'll move then to intentional action. Intentional actions, as we saw, are a subcategory of habitual actions, but they have an additional condition. So all of these, both habitual and intentional actions, of course, must satisfy Aristotle's three conditions of being having knowledge, choice, and stable character. To be intentional, an action has to satisfy an additional condition. So intentional actions are voluntary actions, but in addition are performed under the agent's description. That we want the agent to have the understanding of the action in his or her mind. So for example, I'm going to do X, and then I do X. This will be relevant ethically, as we'll see, because actions can be described in different ways. For example, turning on the light, flipping the switch, waking up the cat, alerting the burglar. Are those 4 actions or 1 action with 1 description? We don't need to worry too much about that. But it is important to see that the same motion, set of motions, can be described in different ways, given a person's interest in them. So let's turn next to seeing what it is. To understand this, get a better handle on it, it will be useful to look at sources of excuse. Why do we excuse people? What does it mean to excuse somebody? Two sources of excuse: ignorance and inability. Now, notice each is a limitation of one or the other of our first 2 conditions of voluntary action. To be ignorant is not to know, to some extent. To be unable is to have our choice limited. But let us look at these in turns. Not all ignorance is relevant. There are 2 kinds that are. First is ignorance of the relevant act description. Let's say we have a married couple, one of whom is going off on a business trip. Let's say it's the husband. He's left on Sunday evening. He expects to get back Wednesday. It's Tuesday evening. So his wife has turned in for the night. House is dark. A few moments later, she hears sound at the door, front door, footsteps on the stairs, a dark, shadowy figure in the doorway. By this time, she's pulled her .38 out of the nightstand, opens fire, turns on the light. Her husband lies dead, crumpled on the floor. Now, has she murdered her husband? Well, what if her description is shooting the intruder? I don't know to what extent that would be relevant legally, but morally, that sounds pretty good. She had a different act description in mind. And that morally, that is relevant to our being able to assign blame. Second, applicable moral standard. This is a little suspicious, isn't it? This sounds like if somebody doesn't know what the applicable moral standard is, that they have failed in being raised properly or morally acculturated. 2 examples. Let's say the sheriff's deputy shows up at somebody's house with a warrant for his arrest. This is what for? For growing cannabis. What cannabis? Where? What? This is the stuff in the back 40 out there. Or I'm sorry, we should have said marijuana, for growing marijuana. So when marijuana. And he pulls out the seed packet, says cannabis on it. Didn't know that cannabis and marijuana were the same thing. Now, again, legal, I don't know what kind of excuse that would be. Probably not very good. But morally it is. He didn't realize that what he was doing was morally wrong, because he didn't see what the standard was. A more serious example of this would be the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann after World War II. He was responsible for the logistics for bringing hundreds of thousands of people to Auschwitz, to their deaths. They finally caught up with him in Argentina, and at his war trial in Jerusalem, argued that he was only following orders, that he didn't know that was wrong. Now, as incredible as that might sound to us, if it's true, then that would be a potentially legitimate excuse. That handles then kinds of ignorance that are relevant. Let's turn next to inability. Three kinds this time: compulsion, duress, and lack of skill. And these are distinguished by their degree of excuse-making capacity. That is, actions that are compelled are clearly excused, are most easily excused. Actions that were performed under lack of skill, because of lack of skill, are the most questionable. To be compelled, and this is because to be compelled, first off, is a purely objective circumstance. When we're compelled to do something, we can legitimately say, I could not have done otherwise. We may have been, this can be through the actions of somebody else, or through just natural circumstance. So your car breaking down, again, compels you to remain where you are because you could not have done otherwise. It's an instance of not being able to do otherwise. If someone locks you in your house and you could not make a meeting, say that was important again, that would be an instance of compulsion. So compulsion is a purely objective circumstance. It requires no moral evaluation at all, no normative evaluation. Actions performed under duress are a little more interesting. Here, the agent has control over what he or she is doing. The question is whether the cost of doing otherwise would be such as to offer an excuse for what was done. Aristotle's example is a sea captain who in a storm jettisons the ship's cargo. Now, when the ship gets back in port, the ship owners aren't going to be too pleased to know that the cargo is gone, but they trust the captain's judgment. And if the captain explains the circumstances of being in a storm with a weighted down ship, then they would prefer to have the ship than the cargo, if having an exclusive choice between the two, and perhaps would excuse him then. Notice that this requires judgment. We can explain duress in terms of perhaps doing X rather than Y. You have a choice. Another example would be a gas station or convenience store clerk who is held up, and the hold-up guy says, "Give me the money or I'll blow your head off." Now, the clerk has control of the cash register, of course, but the cost of not complying with the bandit is so great that pretty clearly that's an excuse for having done that. So doing X rather than Y. Now, having just discussed compulsion, we might say, well, apart from compulsion, isn't it always the case of doing X rather than Y? Yes, but again, it's the cost of doing otherwise. So take Aristotle's example, again, of jettisoning cargo of your ship. If we have this time a Great Lakes freighter captain who has tickets to a Bucks game, and he's on Lake Erie, and he knows that if he's going to miss the game, unless he jettisons the cargo, well, he's doing the same thing as the captain in the first instance, but under just entirely different circumstances, of course. That is obviously not excusable. The third, lack of skill, is most difficult of all, mainly because we, the people who are interested in making a judgment of the action, in holding a person accountable, don't have access to that person's state of mind. Let's say that if somebody gets his driver's license in November, having never driven at all under winter conditions. And the first time he gets on the ice, he gets an offender bender for which he's responsible. Maybe some of us have been there. We could understand that. Compare that with the instance of an elderly man who's been driving many years, who has night blindness, and he's driving in a suburban neighborhood on trick-or-treat night, and it's dark, and he hits some kids. Well, he should have known better. We can be comfortable in our belief that he should have known better. But then it shades off in the middle. Let's turn next to Jeremy Bentham on intentional action. Oh, sorry, I'm going back a bit. Just for the moment, going back to ignorance. It really doesn't matter what causes ignorance, just the fact that one is or not. If someone, for example, is so drunk that he literally doesn't know what he's doing, then his actions would not be intended under the relevant description. It's a different question whether people are to be held responsible or liable for punishment in those cases. But we shouldn't distort our account of intentional action to make it fit more closely with our views about responsibility and punishment. We need to get clear on these concepts. I mean, that's the purpose of getting clear on them. Then we can be comfortable in deciding praise or blame. All right, so we have our central case of an intentional action. It's an action that's both directly intended under the description in question and is executed. We have both an end in view and an end in fact, and they coincide. Intending involves both a desire to do something and a belief that the action will accomplish that end. We can intend to do only something that we believe that we can and will do. So if we were on campus in a classroom and I said, well, I'm going to fly back to my office after class, then clearly I'd be deranged or something. If I would suggest, let's get real small, how do you even try to do that? That's misunderstanding of language or something. How about the basketball player who shoots the three-pointer at the buzzer, or the quarterback who throws the Hail Mary pass? Is there an intention there to score? Well, yes, yeah. And there's a sufficient probability that the action that's performed would accomplish the goal that enables us to say, yes, it was intended that the points be scored. Notice we can aim at something as a means and not necessarily as an end. We can, intentions don't need to be preformed. Remember our example of somebody who runs for exercise and the routes that he takes are different. But maybe they don't diverge until the end of the street. So he goes down the street, not knowing which way he's going to go until he gets there. That's entirely possible. So we'll start to do something without knowing what the goal is going to be. We fail. We can do things that don't accomplish their ends. We can form an intention now to do something in the future. All of those are possible. Now we'll consider Bentham. We'll talk about Bentham more when we get to utilitarianism. Bentham has a very useful distinction in two kinds of intention: direct intention and oblique intention. Because what we directly intend are the ends and the means of our actions. We directly intend the goal, and we directly intend the means by which we accomplish the goal. So if we're, say, in the library building and the room is stuffy, there's a nice breeze outside, we want to cool off the room, which is our end, and opening the window is the means to accomplish the end. Both of those are directly intended. Bentham says we obliquely intend the side effects of our actions, of which we are aware. The awareness is very important here. Continue with the same example, opening the window in the library building. Let's say we're next to the window, and in front of us is a student who's placed some materials on the windowsill. And very important, the student tends to give a senior design presentation later in the afternoon. Nice breeze outside. We know there's some probability that if we open the window, the papers will blow out. We open the window and the papers blow out. Are we responsible for that? Well, We intended it, Bentham said, because we knew that there was some possibility of that happening. It's not why we opened the window, but to the extent that we knew that it was possible, we didn't indeed intend it. This is somewhat controversial. In Catholic moral theology, there is the principle of double effect, which is basically simply a denial of oblique intention. The standard example of this would be, say, a patient who has maybe end-stage bone cancer, very painful. The patient isn't expected to live beyond a couple more days. The patient is receiving morphine for pain relief. Morphine is a very effective pain reliever, but it has two additional properties. One is that you need increasingly large dosages of it in order to have the same pain relief because you build up a tolerance to it. And the second is that it depresses respiration. So we're at the intersection of those two curves, that to get the pain relief that the patient needs may require giving the patient a dose that would stop the patient's breathing. The physician understands this and thinks that all things considered, this is not the worst thing for this patient if he would die under these circumstances. Now, under the principle of double effect, the question is, did the doctor intend for the patient to die? Bentham would say, you betcha. It's obliquely intended. Somebody who believes in the principle of double effect would say, no, it was an anticipated consequence, but the intention was the pain relief. So I'll leave that there, but it's a somewhat controversial idea. There are, of course, actions that are not, the world is messy. There are actions that are not fully deliberate. We mentioned actions done in a condition of rage or terror. An agent can know of a consequence that he neither seeks nor accepts. That is, he can bring something about knowingly, but without intending it, even obliquely, if he's not thinking clearly in the ways that we've said is necessary for assigning responsibility in terms of intention. For example, many years ago, back in the 60s, there was Jay Powell's predecessor as chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, famous for having a mind like a steel trap. But he was, it was really dangerous to drive with him. He would be so intent on getting where he's going that he would drive over the railroad tracks knowing that a train was coming, intent to get on the other side. He's not weighing the possible consequences then. All right, so far we said that intention is a moral psychological concept. It is a factual psychological question whether an action is intentional or voluntary. It is a legal or moral question whether and in what ways an agent should be held responsible. So let's put the two together. We'll say hypothetically, give us a straight rule here. Let's try this, see if this works. We'll say we're responsible for all and only our intentional actions. Remember, we can't say we're responsible for all and only our voluntary actions because it's not, voluntary action isn't fine-grained enough. That habitual actions are such that we're not thinking about them when we do them. So that was the purpose of introducing intentional action. So how about it? Are we responsible for all and only our intentional actions? Let's consider punishment for a moment. Now, what are the two main theories of punishment? And why do we punish people? On the one hand is deterrence, that we punish somebody to dissuade that person and others from not doing that sort of thing in the future. The other is retribution, because we might punish somebody just because we believe, just because they deserve it, regardless of any deterrent effect. So let's consider deterrence. The idea would be that only intentional action can be deterred And it's only intentional actions then for which people should be punished. And we can understand blame as an informal form of punishment. Sounds plausible, but actually that's an unsound argument. It's true that only intentional action can be deterred, and that a penalty under the law deters somebody only if the agent sees it as being attached to some future intentional action of the same kind. You have to understand the kind of action that you're doing, that if you do the same kind of thing in the future, you could be punished again. But it's not true that people are deterred only by the punishment of intentional action, interestingly. Say, you could get greater deterrence out of punishing all people who kill rather than punishing only those who kill intentionally. This gives us a chance to compare the law with morality. Incidentally, in the final, there'll be a 10-point short answer question. That question, I can tell you what it's going to be. The question will be, explain the difference between the law and morality, or maybe it'll be worded between a legal problem and a moral problem. Here's one possible, we'll cover two possible answers to that. Here's the first one. The law requires an external sanction, a punishment. So let's look at the mechanisms, the comparative mechanisms of law and morality. How does the law get people to do what the law wants them to do? By having a sanction. Punishment requires knowledge that an action is illegal, that is, implying the belief that one will be punished if one violates the law. So to work at all, the law must be clearly understandable that this action is illegal, which means if you do it, you'll be fined or imprisoned or something. Morality, on the other hand, requires in a parallel way that an action is immoral. But in addition, it requires recognition that I myself am immoral if I perform that sort of action. Morality works by modifying an agent's view of their possible actions by attaching to them a moral characterization and a characterization of the agent himself. There's no room left for the uncertainties and mistakes of enforcement that happen under the law. The law is, or rather morality is a lot more subtle than the law. So a lot of people think if we have a law for something, you don't need to worry about morality. Morality is squishy, is messy, is some people might even say it's up to opinion. We'll have to show why that's confused later on. But the law is clear, isn't it? The law has a punishment. It's strong. It has teeth. Morality doesn't have teeth. Fact is, morality doesn't need teeth. The law needs a stick. The law needs universal compliance. And for any given law, it's rarely the case that everybody believes that the law is a good one. So the law cannot depend on people seeing the wisdom of the law. It needs a stick to hold over people's heads to get universal compliance. Morality doesn't need that. Morality works within internal sanction, guilt. It says if we understand, so morality requires being able to take ownership of your actions. We know we did it. So it works. It works by assigning blame. And what does blame do? Makes one feel guilty. So we need to be careful when, I don't know, therapists, somebody, you often hear, Don't blame the person, blame the action. Nonsense. You blame the person. That's how morality works. It's uncomfortable. We may not like it, but it works. So morality does work. And notice, the law can punish the wrong person. The law can punish somebody, as we know from DNA evidence and so on, that it turns out somebody did not do the thing for which he's been in prison for decades. That can't happen with morality. If we blame somebody for what they've done, and it turns out that they did not do it, they know that. They may get ticked off at us for blaming them, but they certainly won't feel guilty about it. So that is one of two ways by which we can distinguish the mechanism of morality from the mechanism of law. All right, finally, let's, the straight rule was something of a hypothesis. There's a problem for the straight rule. All intentional actions. So what is negligence, first off? It's a very important concept for professional practice. This is it's on the basis of negligence that people are found to perform malpractice. So, now, as we know, all intentional actions are voluntary, and all voluntary actions imply the agent's knowledge of what the agent is doing. Negligence, on the other hand, implies ignorance. Negligence doesn't mean malice. A negligent person isn't doing something out of spite. The negligent person is careless. They're ignorant of what could possibly happen, of what is going to happen because of the negligence. Hence the problem. Voluntary action implies knowledge. Negligence implies ignorance. You will see a question on that. What is the problem that negligence poses for the straight rule? It has to do with this, that voluntary action implies knowledge, negligence implies ignorance. That's all you need to answer that. There's a way out. This whole discussion of responsibility I'm taking from John Mackey's excellent discussion of responsibility in his book, Ethics. And Mackey suggests that it would be more rational to blame somebody for the negligence itself, for the carelessness, rather than the consequence of the carelessness. The negligent person isn't aware of what's actually going to happen because they're careless, but we can hold them accountable for being careless. And that's particularly true when it's when the person concerned is a professional. We expect professionals to know better, to be careful. Now, to sum up here, there are problem cases of this account of responsibility. We've mentioned some already, people acting out of rage, impulsively, out of low intelligence. There are the cases of a person being able to say, I wasn't myself, or irresistible impulses. That's why the stable character requirement is there. And that's difficult. It's difficult to judge what's relevant when it comes to stable character, of course, but it's there to handle those difficult sorts of cases. And somebody may say, well, wait a minute, what about children? Children, there's no lack of intentionality in children, is there? Why do we hold them less responsible then? It's because we expect children to only gradually become responsive to moral pressure. Now, a psychopath is childlike in this respect, isn't he? The psychopath isn't able to think in terms of other people's interests, to care about other people's interests. The difference, of course, is that the psychopath has no hope. There's no possibility of the psychopath becoming brought into the moral community, while children eventually are, of course, eventually. So that is the end of our discussion of responsibility. There, you'll see on Blackboard in the materials posted there, a case, Occidental Engineering, from the website onlineethics.org. This is a nice case to be able to approach from the point of view of responsibility. You'll see several discussion questions associated with that case.